One thing that's often said by those in favor of suicide prevention is that suicide is to harm oneself. To this, one might reply in the following way that, first of all, it's not obvious that suicide is to harm oneself in the way people think. Certainly, one can argue that death, given the demonstrably, I think, poor quality of our lives, is always a benefit for the one who dies. But suppose, for the sake of argument, that the optimist is correct, that lives are usually good on balance, that suicide is a mistake most of the time. But what would follow from this? After all, there are lots of things which are considered to be harmful to one's body or mind, but that we nevertheless do not regard as acceptable to prevent through force or coercion, though persuasion can often be acceptable. In short, we allow people, provided they are adequately informed, to harm themselves, or at any rate to act in ways which many consider harmful. And so the sort of underlying principle here is that self-regarding actions, which is to say those which primarily concern ourselves, should be respected regardless of what others may want us to do or even believe is in our best interest. Now, there are exceptions to this, certainly. For example, laws which regulate the use of helmets and seatbelts could be seen as possible exceptions. But I do think cases like these are relatively minor in that having to wear seatbelts when we may not particularly want to is not the sort of assault on individual free choice comparable to compelling someone to stay alive against their will. But I also think that though concepts like liberty and autonomy are clearly very useful in discussing this issue, suicide can be defended on a hedonistic and consequentialist basis as well. That is, one can also say that suicide, generally speaking, prevents more misery than it produces, and is therefore justified. Consider what Hume says on this subject. I believe that no one ever threw away life while it was worth keeping. For such is our natural horror of death, that small motives will never be able to reconcile us to it. So in other words, if someone is seriously considering suicide, we can be fairly certain in most cases, I think, that such a person is profoundly unhappy. And so I think it's not unreasonable to suppose that most of the time, I won't say all the time, but I think most of the time, the suffering that is avoided by suicide exceeds the suffering produced by it for those affected by the death, and would therefore be, on this view as well, a net benefit. Finally, the claim, not uncommon, that suicide is symptomatic of a disorder of the mind is, I think, really just an empty assertion, much like claiming that being gay or lesbian is a mental disorder. And inasmuch as the term mental disorder strongly suggests moral disorder, it assumes that suicide is something to be morally opposed without explanation. Thomas Szasz writes very compellingly in this connection about the ways in which modern societies and the psychiatric establishment routinely treat desires as though they were diseases. But while a disease is something that happens to a person, a desire, or the thing desired, is something that a person wills or causes to happen. And in this sense, suicide is a desire, clearly. It is not a disease, nor is it a so-called mental illness. So that is all for now. Thanks for listening.